I would like to welcome you all to Rice University and to the Baker Institute for Public Policy. This is a talk that is the result of a collaboration between the Baker Institute, which, as you know, is the top university-affiliated think tank in the world, the newcomer on the Rice block, Rice Global, which functions as the impact accelerator for Rice research around the world, and the Chao Center for Asian Studies, which is the research hub for scholars at Rice working in Asian studies, and is directed by Professor Lisa Balaban-Lilar, who I'd like to thank for all of her great collaboration. As the Vice President for Rice's Developing Global Strategy, I am particularly pleased and honored to have Tharoor with us at the beginning of the university's strategic work in India. In November, we will be formally opening the Rice Global India Center in Bangalore. RGI, as it is known, will be the university's incubator for developing research, innovation, and advanced educational exchange with diverse industries and academic communities in India. I can think of no one better than Dr. Tharoor to be with Rice as we embark on this momentous endeavor. Ambassador Satterfield will tell you more about Dr. Tharoor's political contributions, and you will hear much of his political views in a moment. I would only like to add to that astonishing record that in addition to an illustrious political career, Tharoor is the best-selling author of 26 books translated into over a dozen languages and reprinted dozens of times in India, including, of course, the great Indian novel and the Era of Darkness. In Tharoor's memorable words, he says, "India shaped my mind, anchored my identity, influenced my beliefs, and made me who I am. India matters to me, and I would like to matter to India." Baker Institute Director, Ambassador Satterfield, I leave it to you to describe how Tharoor has mattered to India, in India, and beyond India. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming to Baker Hall. We're delighted to see you all tonight. This is the second in what will be a series of notable speaker events for the fall term. We are very happy for those of you who are new to the Baker Institute, new to our event schedule. I would invite all of you, we are admittedly shameless about this, to join our roundtable to help us continue to have the kind of public-facing outreach programs with individuals like Dr. Tharoor. Last night we had Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, two of the leading political analysts and authors on the U.S. journalistic scene, discussing politics in America. We will have Dave Petraeus coming in just a very few weeks, and a number of other notable guests talking about Texas, the United States, and the world. So happy to see you all here. Help us to keep these events going. And many thanks to our colleagues at Rice University, Caroline, to you, and to the Chao Center for their work to organize this event. Dr. Tharoor is, as Caroline said, an author, a politician, an international civil servant of extraordinary ability, and we are delighted, Shashi, to have you here again, 31 years on from one of the inaugural speaker appearances for the Baker Institute in its formative years. Dr. Tharoor is currently a member of the Indian National Congress Party and is a fourth-term lower house of parliament, a House of the People member. You represent a constituency in Kerala State, and you previously served as Minister of State for Human Resource Development and Minister of State for External Affairs, Foreign Relations in the Indian government. During your nearly three-decade-long prior career at the United Nations, where you and I came into very close contact, you served as a peacemaker, a peacekeeper, a refugee worker, and an administrator at the highest levels, serving with an individual we both admire greatly, former Secretary General Kofi Annan, ultimately as Undersecretary General of the United Nations. And I want to thank you for being here. We're going to have a dialogue this afternoon talking about India, its role in the region, in Asia, its role in the world, both today and in the future. We'll reflect upon U.S.-Indian relations, upon China's relationship with India, Pakistani-Indian relations, and above all, how in a time of global disorder, India sees itself, as Dr. Tharoor would assess it, and how the U.S., and I may offer a few comments here, sees India as an absolutely critical and quite strategic partner. I will turn to you first with a continuation of the remarks I just made. India's role around the globe, technology, industry, development, the global economy, is, I think, arguably at a greater, higher point today than it has ever been, with every expectation that it will increase as time goes by, whether in its own merits vis-a-vis China, in Asia, beyond Asia, as a critical point of origin for tech, for materials, as a conduit point, connectivity point for all of this. But as we look at those very positive trend lines and expectations, as if with the United States, the issue of your immediate neighbors, Pakistan, China, come in. Where does your relationship or relationships go? Where do domestic politics go? And so I turn the floor over to you for some opening thoughts on those few minor issues.
That's a vast range of issues. Thank you very much, David, and it's very good to be back at the Baker Institute after 31 years. I can't remember if this building existed.
It did not.
When I came in 93. So
it wasn't here.
A smaller hall and a smaller audience alongside Dominique de Villepin, who then went on to become foreign minister and subsequently prime minister of France.
Yes, indeed.
I'm afraid I didn't quite do as well, but we were both side by side. So clearly this institution brings luck to its speakers. Thank you.
Shashi.
India matters. I mean, on that there's no doubt. It's also already now the world's most populous country. So what happens to India affects a sixth of humanity, and presumably as other countries' population declines and ours keeps growing, it's going to be a larger percentage of the world population. India also matters because its economy is significant. It's the world's fastest growing major economy, even today when China has begun to decelerate a bit, and it is already in purchasing power parity terms the third largest economy in the world. So India is beyond the stage of either being ignored or taken for granted. It matters anyway. And the choices it makes, I think, will resonate. There is also, certainly from the Western and particularly American point of view, the potential India represents to offer an alternative, if not quite a counterweight, to a China whose behavior has been transformed under its current leadership from what it was for a generation. The so-called peaceful rise seems to be pretty much laid to rest now. Deng Xiaoping's famous exhortation to sort of bide your time, hide your intentions, and grow peacefully. They no longer have any need to bide their time or hide their intentions. They've been quite assertive on their periphery, and we, I'm afraid, have taken a rather nasty blow or two on our disputed frontier with China. The world still, I think, including Washington, if you'll forgive me for saying so, is still a bit uncertain about how to deal with China. Do they manage it? Do they confront it? And are we talking containment? Are we talking about constraining China? None of that is entirely clear, and India is no less ambiguous in the degree of its resistance to the way China has been behaving with it. On the one hand, there's stern language about the misbehavior on the border, and the foreign minister even using words like India has a China problem, and so do other countries, but ours is worse. he just said last week. But at the same time, India's import dependence on China keeps growing. And ever since a very unpleasant incident on the border where 20 Indian soldiers were killed by the Chinese without provocation, we are looking at a doubling of our import dependency to $100 billion negative in terms of Chinese exports to India. So in other words, the imports are growing while our geopolitical confrontation is worsening,
Yes.
Which is in a contradiction that points to the same degree of confusion that I see in the West. Certainly, I've just come from Europe last week, and I get the distinct impression that many Europeans are not convinced that for them China is in any way a threat or a problem or a worry, and many of them actually welcome China's growth and influence and want to work with it and profit from it and so on. So I don't think the world has anything like a completely clear bipolarity as we had during the Cold War. But this is a problem that we all have to confront, and Washington to some degree or the other looks at India through the lens of being the non-China. At the same time, if you look at India's development, the extraordinary process of getting 1.4 billion people into the 21st century and integrating them into the global village, that's a phenomenal and mammoth undertaking which cannot but affect the rest of the world, and everything from our energy consumption, which keeps going up, to trade, though on that again there's some ambiguity as to how willing India is to be in opening up its trade. All of these things, I think, are going to have resonance and echoes. And you ended by asking about India's domestic politics. We've just had an election. The results came out in the first week of June. And though Mr. Modi, who had been dominating Indian politics for the preceding 10 years, with his party, the BJP, enjoying a comprehensive majority on its own in both those elections, though he won and remains in power as Prime Minister, he's a somewhat diminished figure because he lost his majority and is dependent on allies who do not share his core Hindutva ideology, this Hindu nationalist or chauvinist ideology that he has been the principal advocate of for quite some time. So all of this means that our domestic politics has also become more interesting to the observer and the participant. I'm in the latter category as well as the former. And I will say that if you look at all of that, India is poised at a fascinating time for the outside observer, and I hope the Baker Institute will keep paying attention to it in the years to come.
We will indeed, and the attention that we pay is a reflection of the attention that the United States at the highest levels is paying. And just to comment on your remarks, the administration has grappled, as every administration has had to in recent years and will have to, no matter who wins the election, with the problem of China. And you're correct, there have been different and sometimes contradictory approaches taken. Does one embrace China and try by suasion to bring them in, or do you confront them all out? This administration, earlier this year, after the 2 trips to Beijing by Bill Burns, the director of the CIA, and then Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, articulated a policy publicly towards China, which is a mix of confrontation on those issues that are fundamentally defined by the U.S. as threatening our basic interests, competition, which we may win or we may lose, but in which we are happy to engage where the field is open, and then cooperation on those areas, and there are such areas where China's policies and actions are coincident in whole or in part with U.S. interests. It's a more nuanced and sophisticated approach. But with respect to India, there is no doubt that the United States in this administration has sought the closest possible strategic ties with India to the extent of, while not ignoring, that would be an inaccurate description, being willing to look beyond Mr. Modi's both rhetoric and actions, which we find highly objectionable, to the strategic import of India as India, beyond one man, one government.
Do you mean his international actions and statements or his domestic?
His domestic
Yeah.
actions and statements, many of which are highly repugnant, as I know you find them. But India carries enormous strategic weight, and not only as the non-China. That's an unfair simplification. But there is certainly a desire on the part of the United States to help India, or at least deter China from establishing a dominance which can hold sway over Indian policies. This would not be in U.S. national interest. On the energy side, the United States never sanctioned, has no intention of sanctioning India over purchases of Russian oil. There are various reasons for this,
There are.
but one of them at the most basic level is the understanding India must have fuel.
Absolutely. And you know, it's true that we have taken advantage of the fact that most countries cannot buy Russian oil under sanctions, and we've improved or increased our import of Russian oil and gas from, I think it used to be 3 or 4%
Yes.
of our oil and gas imports to about 45% today. But there are, I think, beyond the US's respect for India's strategic importance, I think there is the understanding that, number one, by doing that, India at least soaks up that oil, because if not, India would be competing with other countries for the remaining oil available in the world, in the Middle East and everywhere else, thereby driving up prices for everybody, including for all of you at the pump. So the fact that India is able to divert its purchases into an area that's less tenanted, as it were, helps keep the rest of the world's oil prices down. And that, I think, the US doesn't entirely mind. And then there is a slightly cynical argument, which I know people don't like talking about very much, but much of India's Russian oil and gas goes into a mix, including with other imports, and gets refined in the world's largest refinery in India, and then is sold to the US and to British consumers.
It loses its identity as Russian.
It loses its identity as
Yes.
Russian, but
A-
the fact is there is a certain
That's a term of art.
yeah, there is a certain cynicism about the moral righteousness of people saying, how can you buy Russian oil, as some Europeans do, while they're consuming refined Indian oil products which originated partly in Russia. But anyway, I mean, the point is, you're quite right. I think the US has been much more understanding than perhaps an earlier administration might have been.
Yes.
Say 25 years ago. I mean, we've had now a generation where Indo-US relations have been consensually bipartisan on both sides. From the late Clinton administration onwards, every US president has been supportive and publicly supportive in recognizing India. And I would argue that both the parties in government in India, Congress and the BJP, both leading coalitions and when on their own, have been strongly supportive of the Indo-US relationship too. So I think that's one issue where, almost irrespective of your election outcome in November and ours last June, I don't really think that our relationship is going to be terribly affected. I think India and the US will continue to have close relations. And I might add that the Indian-American community, so well represented here, is also a very strong driver of this, because I think the
Absolutely.
American political process will not be allowed to be indifferent to India by all these good folks who vote here and contribute to American candidates.
The one area of concern I would simply put on the screen in this otherwise rosy picture of the time ahead is the question of international trade policy, in which it is not a singling out of India, but broadly speaking, no matter which of the candidates wins, the question mark over the approach to international trade, agreements or no agreements, quota arrangements or unwillingness to enter into quota arrangements, tariffs. That looms large over domestic policy. It does now in this administration, it did in the prior administration, it will undoubtedly continue to. So I simply note that will be an issue as India's weight in the global economy and global trade, both Indian originated and through India from other sources. What the US chooses to do on trade policy will matter greatly, of course, to us and America's citizens, but it will matter to India
It
as
matters
well.
to us too. Of course, you've got this already proclaimed desire to decouple or at least de-risk in terms of dependence on China. And frankly, I think we need the same approach, because our dependence on China is not healthy for a country where the Chinese are sitting on our frontiers and nibbling away at them. Secondly, you seem to be having an increasing partiality for this near-shoring that is bringing production lines, supplies, manufacturing either back home or closer to home. That doesn't help us because we're pretty far away, but then you also have friend-shoring, and we'd like to think
Yes.
that as a friend, we could be a trade alternative in some respects. Some of this will have to play itself out, and I certainly recall that Mr. Trump's previous administration, which basically started a trade war with China, was throughout pretty friendly with India on trade. My difficulty is that India itself is becoming more attracted to tariffs and protection. And that's partially the influence of our domestic industry, partially the government's own desire to promote what they call Make in India, all of which does raise certain questions from our own approach as well. And it's certainly worth watching, because we all remember how competitive tariff protections led to the Great Depression around the world in the 1930s.
No
We can't miss
return
that.
to the corn laws.
Yeah, and the Smoot-Hawley tariff, remember those?
Yes, indeed. Let me ask you, China.
Yeah.
India finds itself in the curious situation of cognitive dissonance, policy dissonance. China's a threat, China's a challenge.
Yeah.
At the same time, China is a critical neighbor.
Yeah.
You're a member of the BRICS.
Yep.
You are the I in the BRICS.
And worse, we're a member of RIC, the annual trilateral meeting with Russia and China, of BASIC, which leaves out the Russians but includes the Chinese for environmental negotiations. So we've got the Chinese, we're in bed with the Chinese in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization too, and of course the new development bank of BRICS, where we actually provided the first CEO and China provided the headquarters. So there's a lot of interpenetration there.
Tell us what
But
BRICS...
all this began before they killed 20 of our soldiers.
Yes.
So.
Tell us what BRICS means today to India as you see it.
You see,
not.
You know, what's happening, David, I think we have to appreciate this, and you and I have both been at the UN, so you know, there is a certain wobbliness about global multilateralism that is being supplanted increasingly by what people variously call plurilaterals or minilaterals. There is smaller groupings of countries, so they're still multilateral, but they're not global anymore. And BRICS began, as you know, as a 4-country organization, then became 5, has added 11 last year.
Added in a technical sense.
Yeah, well, yes, but I think the plan is to have further integration at the next summit. So there's more talk now of BRICS representing a kind of alternative to the dominant model. India has been trying a foreign policy of working with the non-West without being anti-West. Now, that's not true of every member in the group, but it is of most. And so, despite the expansion, I'm not expecting BRICS to be a sort of anti-Western platform. But it is going to represent a different collection of countries and things. For it to work effectively, however, India-China relations will have to improve, because there's a lot of mistrust there, certainly on our side. You see, from 1976, when Mao famously smiled at the Indian ambassador in a reception in Beijing, right up to 2020, not a shot had been fired in anger across the India-China border, and they had worked out a rather sensible modus vivendi to manage their disputes. I mean, if we thought our border went up to there, and the Chinese claimed their border went up to here, well, we patrolled up to there on Monday, and the Chinese patrolled in the same zone up to on Tuesday. And we made sure we didn't, once in a while, the guns were pointed at each other, but never fired, and there were never any major incidents. But those were the days of the so-called peaceful rise, when China wanted to be accommodative. There were 65 patrolling points like this right across the length of our very, very long disputed frontier. But suddenly, in 26 of those points, the Chinese have just gone and parked themselves. They've come in as they used to, but instead of withdrawing as they used to, they just stayed put. And in one of them, in northeastern Ladakh, a place called the Galwan Valley, when our soldiers went unarmed to say, "What are you guys still doing here? It's our turn to come, move on," buzz off kind of thing. They were pushed off a cliff and the brawl broke out, and 20 Indian soldiers died, and apparently 4 Chinese too. But I mean, it was a totally unnecessary incident because of a refusal to honor a modus vivendi which had been working perfectly well for decades before. And ever since, India has been insisting on the restoration of the status quo ante, and the Chinese have refused. They've in fact started building rather permanent-looking installations. And there are 26 places the Indian Army used to be able to patrol that it no longer can. They're clearly trying to change the realities on the ground.
The land equivalent
Yeah.
of the Chinese atoll
In the
constructions.
seas, exactly.
In the
so
South
there's
China Sea.
belligerence everywhere. They're showing it domestically with the Uyghurs. They've been nasty to Hong Kong with the essential abolition, really, of the different systems they had there. And now you've got the belligerent incidents with Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, in the waters of the South China Sea. So there's a new assertive China there, and I think it'll be, and all these countries have some economic dependence and interdependence in relationships with China, but it'll be crazy of us to overlook that. So that's something that really
But
matters.
through this all, it's still correct to view India as non-aligned.
Well, the word I used when I was minister, which sank without trace at that time, but fortunately has been resurrected by today's foreign minister, is multi-alignment rather than non-alignment.
Okay.
And I would point out that even then, that India actually was no longer just non-aligned in the sense of staying clear of taking sides in the Cold War bipolarity, because obviously the Cold War bipolarity no longer exists. I mean, even if the US and China are eyeing each other warily, there's still so many more degrees of interdependence than there ever were between the Soviet Union and the US. So it's not the same situation. But what India does now is it plays a role with all these multiple configurations, as I mentioned to you, the BASIC and the BRICS and the RIC and IBSA, the Indo-Brazil, South Africa thing for South-South cooperation. On top of that, you've got a fair amount of contradictions in the fact that India is simultaneously in the old non-aligned movement, which used to rail against Western imperial powers, and is a member of the community of democracies under the leadership of the very Western powers it otherwise criticizes. So it used to be a major leader of the G77, the kind of global trade union of developing countries, and that's a major voice in the G20, which macro manages the world macroeconomy. Or it's focused very much on its immediate neighborhood and not doing terribly well in it, I might add, but at the same time, it aspires to a global role with a possible one-day permanent seat in the Security Council. So you've got all of these different objectives India pursues at the same time, and that wonderful, the fact that our name begins with the most convenient element in any acronym, a vowel, enables us to be members of various alphabet soups in these plurilateral and everyone needs India.
And in addition,
and frankly, we also have something to contribute to all of them.
and an additive to the alphabet soup is the very recent declaration of an India, Middle East, Europe
Economic
conduit.
corridor.
The idea of an alternative to Belt and Road.
That's right.
Is there life there?
It could be, except that the Gaza war came at a very bad time, just after this was announced, and obviously because you remember, it
Yes.
meant going across some Arab countries by land and ending up at the port of Haifa,
Yes.
which is not exactly feasible right now, as long as that nasty conflict keeps carrying on. So it is, I wouldn't say it's stillborn, but it certainly hasn't entirely emerged.
But you see a potential for it.
The concept is
beyond rhetorical. You see
Yeah.
a real world trade corridor.
The concept is certainly a very, very good one, but in the earlier world in which you had the Abraham Accords and the Saudis and the Israelis were talking or beginning to talk of normalization and so on, yes, it was very feasible. Today, with tensions on the rise in the region, it's a different story. Equally, there's the Quad, where India, Japan, Australia, and the US have got together in something nobody calls an alliance, but a strategic partnership, and it's actually very important because we've now redefined the subgeography as the Indo-Pacific, a term we never used to hear before, but is now, for about 10 years, the term of art for describing that collectivity straddling the Indian and Pacific Oceans, which will, of course, be an extremely important theater for whatever happens or doesn't happen with China.
Let's talk about another neighbor, Pakistan.
Yeah. What can I say? It's been a very, very unpleasant and deeply unfortunate relationship, because I think people have forgotten that when Pakistan was created back in 1947, its founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, actually talked about a country where people would be free to worship as they liked, and where it would have relations with India, he said, comparable in every respect to Canada's relations with the United States. Well, we've gone in exactly the opposite direction. Jinnah died within a few months of independence, and it hasn't gone that way at all. Pakistan has become a strongly Islamist state. A country that at its birth had 23% non-Muslims is now down to 3% non-Muslims. Everybody else has been expelled, persecuted, or converted. You have a situation where at the end of the Afghan war, Pakistan realized they could put to good use the large number of armed to the teeth Islamist mujahideen they had created with, I'm afraid, American blessing, financing, and training to fight the Soviets, but the Soviets were no longer there to fight, so they were diverted towards India instead. And we suffered more than 30 years of sadly Pakistan-inspired directed terrorism in our country, which was no small matter, because you may remember the famous, I mean, our equivalent of your 9/11 was what we call 26/11. We count the dates differently, so it's 26 November of 2008, when terrorists came and essentially killed 166 Indians, including a number of Muslim Indians in the process, and 7 US citizens, I might add, as well, while being directed in a chilling voice by a handler in Pakistan, whose voice was recorded both by Indian intelligence and by British and American subsequently. I mean, while it was happening, and as revealed subsequently. And ever since then, I'm afraid we have just not found normal relations possible. There was a brief spasm of hope when Mr. Modi, perhaps as a result of his inexperience, did something incredibly impulsive. He was in Kabul on a visit in December of 2015, a year and a half after coming to power, when his entire delegation was in the fleet of cars to go to the airport, and his foreign secretary, the civil servant in charge of the ministry, who happens now to be the current foreign minister, reminded him that he had to call the Pakistani Prime Minister, Nawaz Sharif, and wish him on his birthday, which happened to be December 25. So while the rest of the delegation was already in the cars with the engine running, Mr. Modi goes on the phone and says, "Mr. Prime Minister, happy birthday." And Mr. Nawaz says, "You're so close by. Do you realize I'm on your way home? Why don't you just drop by and join my celebration? It also happens to be my granddaughter's wedding today. We'd love to have you." And Mr. Modi, to everyone's astonishment, says, "All right." I mean, the Foreign Office sort of launched, because not only had they had no forewarning of this, it was physically impossible for the Indian ambassador in Islamabad to fly to Lahore, where this celebration was, or to get there in time before the Indian plane would land from Kabul. But Modi said, "What the heck, let's take the risk." And he went there, and they had this bonhomous and rapturous reception, and he participated in the birthday and the wedding of the granddaughter, and went home terribly happy. And then 4 weeks later, the Pakistanis hit an Indian airbase within a few kilometers of the border. Mr. Modi still couldn't believe they would do it to him after his visit. So he invited the Pakistan intelligence to be part of the investigation into who had done this. And again, the Indian security establishment protested, saying, "How can you let Pakistan intelligence into an Indian airbase?" And the Prime Minister said, "Mr. Sharif is my friend, we'll make it happen." They came, they looked, and they went away, and let it be known through the Pakistani media that they actually thought the entire thing was an Indian operation. The Indians did it to themselves just to have Pakistan to blame. Now, you can imagine that when Mr. Modi got wind of all of this, the scales fell rather dramatically from his eyes. And that was the last attempt he ever made at peacemaking with Pakistan. Very ironic. I mean, later that year, there were 2 more attacks, by the way, from across the border, which were repulsed very effectively. And he became an extreme he adopted a policy of not only not having any further dialogue with Pakistan, but essentially of adopting a kind of approach of benign neglect, which I think it's physically impossible to do towards a neighbor. His predecessor as a BJP Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, had famously said, you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your neighbors. We have to live with the neighbors we've got. And he went off and attempted to make peace in an earlier incarnation back in 1999. And he too was betrayed when General Musharraf tried the Kargil stunt of sending army disguised as non-army to take the heights of Kargil and Kashmir. So we'd already had the experience of a Pakistani betrayal once. And I think the conclusion, frankly, was that, look, either the civilian government is unable to control those elements on its side that believe in using the so-called strategy of killing India by a death of 1,000 cuts. That was the famous line, notorious line. Or it's unwilling to control it. Whether it's unable to control it or unwilling to control it, why talk to it? Because you can be as friendly to them as you like, and those who control the guns are going to send them across anyway. That was the conclusion that India has come to. And as a result, I'm afraid, there has been no peace initiative, not even when Pakistan kind of visibly and audibly changed its tack. And both civilians and military started talking the language of peace. India was no longer interested in listening. They'd just been betrayed too often. So I'm afraid all I can say is we don't have much of a relationship. Pakistan's it's a peculiar case because in India, the state has an army. In Pakistan, the army has a state. And the army calls the shots throughout. It has the largest share of any government's budget in the world. No government devotes a larger proportion of its budget or indeed of its GDP to the military. You join the army in India to serve the country. In Pakistan, you join the army to run the country. You not only do it right through your career, but after retirement, the Pakistani army and retired army personnel control everything from petrol stations to real estate developments to import-export companies. It's an extraordinary system. There's a whole book on this called Military Inc.
Yes, I was ambassador to Egypt and am quite familiar with,
there you are.
With the
so
phenomenon.
That's what we're living with. And it's not a pleasant thing to have across the border, but we've decided so far that as long as we shore up our defenses. When I was chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, authored a report on behalf of the committee, which was, by the way, a multi-party committee, so the ruling party was also represented, where we said we understand the government's reluctance to actually have any dealings with either the army of Pakistan or the civilian government that's unable to control these military elements, but we urge more people-to-people contact. We have become very restrictive on visas for Pakistani nationals. I suggested we open up visas to certain categories of people, because I've yet to meet a Pakistani who's come to India who hasn't gone away feeling good about the place. I really think that if we have any prospect of hope, whether now or in the indeterminate future, we need to have some access points. But this government at the moment is not at all receptive to that idea.
And on that theme, one final question to you before we turn to audience questions. Prime Minister Modi, Hindu ultranationalism, rallying the base in rhetoric and actions against India's non-Hindu population.
Well, as you can imagine, I am not happy about that, and I've said so publicly in writing during the election campaign and afterwards. We tend not to want to criticize our government abroad, and I follow that principle for the most part because we'd like to think, as you do in America, that our political differences stop at the water's edge. And that's been an Indian tradition.
A quaint concept, yes.
Well, it's increasingly, especially in a world of globalized social media, become a quaint concept because probably everybody sitting here who follows India knows that I don't like what Mr. Modi says at home, particularly about the 200 million of my fellow citizens who happen to be Muslim. The Islamophobia is truly distasteful and expressed in, as you put it, repugnant language. So there's not anything that anyone can excuse. But to his credit, oddly enough, he's actually done very well in cultivating relations with the Islamic world. It's a paradox. In his first year, I can tell you, he didn't visit us. He went to 27 countries. Now one of them was an Islamic country, and I pointed that out as an opposition politician. I said, this is not good for India. We have good relations with the Muslim world. Why did the Prime Minister not go there? And almost as if to spite me, the following year, he not only went, but he went to some Muslim countries that no Indian leader had been to in decades. I have friends in some of the Arab Gulf countries who've told me that our relations have never been better. So I have to admit that there is a contradiction between how he speaks of and treats Muslims at home and how he deals with Muslim regimes abroad. Now that may be serving India's interests internationally, but I can't help feeling that in this age of social media and so on, that the very, very unpleasant things he says at home aren't being heard and registered and resented in many of the Muslim countries with which India still manages to maintain good relations. And I don't think this is healthy for us, either domestically or globally, in the long term.
You made the point to me in the discussion we had before we came out that he doesn't command the majority of the Hindu population.
He does not, and that's something important for even Hindu friends here to realize. Hindus are 80% of the Indian population. So if you'd won even half of them, you would have 40% of the vote. The BJP and its allies have never had 40% of the vote. In 2014, it was 31%, and they won almost a two-thirds majority because of our first-past-the-post system. In 2019, they did better. They got 37% of the vote. But in 2024, they're down to 36%. The difference was that this time the opposition parties were able to agree in many constituencies to put up a united candidate and didn't divide the opposition vote. And so the first-past-the-post system, which so helped Mr. Modi when there was a divided opposition, when the BJP candidates often won constituencies with just 35% or less than 40 of the vote in a constituency because there were two or more opposition parties taking the rest, that was less easy this time around. And so we do have a situation where it is important to remember Mr. Modi has never won a percentage of the vote that adds up to half the Hindu population of the country. And I think most Indians, including most Hindus that I know, and I'm a Hindu myself and proud of it, believe very much in a culture of accepting difference, of allowing and acknowledging that other people can be who they want to be as long as they don't disturb us in the process. And we will be free to be who we want to be without disturbing us in the process. It's Swami Vivekananda, our great sage, came to Chicago in 1893 and made a famous speech at the World Parliament of Religions, in which one of his great lines, and there were very many, and you can find the address still around, he made 5 short speeches. He was given 3 minutes the first time he came. And when he just began with "Sisters and Brothers of America," he got a standing ovation. And he never looked back. They gave him 5 minutes and said, "Please come back," and they ended up making 5 speeches. But one of the sentences he said in that first speech was that "I'm proud to speak to you on behalf of a faith which has taught the world not just tolerance, but acceptance." Now, I read that as a teenager, and it stayed with me, and I kept thinking and thinking about it, because I was going to school and learning in history class that tolerance was a virtue. A tolerant king was a good guy because he let people in his kingdom believe things he didn't believe. But I realized that what Vivekananda was saying was that at bottom, tolerance is a very patronizing idea. That tolerant king is actually saying, "I have the truth. You are in error, but I will generously indulge you in your right to be wrong." That's all tolerance really is. But Vivekananda says Hinduism is not about that. Hinduism is about acceptance. Hinduism says, "I believe I have the truth. You believe you have the truth. I will respect your truth. Please respect my truth." And that, to my mind, is the great strength of our culture and our civilization for 3,000 years, which is probably why Hinduism has survived longer than in any other faith on the planet, unaffected and as a continuing unbroken civilizational ethos. And to see it being betrayed in its own name by people who are promoting intolerance and bigotry, allegedly in the name of Hinduism, reinterpreted as some sort of monolithic faith with sort of one God, one temple, one leader, one language. That is simply not the Hinduism that I grew up with knowing and cherishing and valuing, and that I think most Hindus don't believe. So though in the process of these more than 10 years now officially sanctioned bigotry, a toxin has been injected into the veins of our society, particularly in northern India, where many have had a chip on the shoulder about Muslim invasions of 1,000 years ago that have been consciously sort of, it's an itch that has been scratched and gouged and brought out again in ways that fortunately we in the south are largely exempt from. But in North India, this very nasty genie is out of the bottle. I'm not quite sure how easy it's going to be to ever put it back. So we've done some damage to ourselves as a culture and as a society through this kind of violent, politicized Hindutva rhetoric that I deeply regret.
Shashi, if we can turn, thank you. If we can turn to questions from the audience.
So those are the slips that the young lady was collecting. Okay.
Those are the slips. How does India plan to achieve energy independence? Does it intend to achieve energy independence in this period of transition?
It does, and I don't know how realistic it is. Mr. Modi committed in Paris that we'd have 50% of our energy needs met by renewable sources by 2030. That is not happening. He also said we will be 100% reliant on renewable energy by 2070, which I thought was a fairly safe distance for him to announce because he's not going to be around to be questioned on it. Look, India is going through a very challenging time because our energy needs keep growing. I mean, along with development comes a certain amount of prosperity, but do not forget there's still a couple of 100 million Indians who cannot take for granted what everyone in this room can, which is that you flick a switch on the wall and your room is bathed with light. We do not have electrification in large numbers of homes, and there are very many homes where we have it, but it's very unreliable, and you just have a few hours of power every day and you don't know when it's coming. So there is a problem, and the demand has been growing, and with climate change and global warming, we are also having increasing demand for the cooling of space. And so, for example, air conditioning in India, the demand is growing up by like 20% a year. So people can now afford air conditioners, they want to buy them, and the result is, and of course the world is hotter, so they need them all the more, etc. We've had 400 heat waves in the last, I'll start that again, 700 heat waves in the last 50 years. And the number of heat waves keeps increasing every year, and they take a toll on human lives. So it's impossible for us, it seems to me, to overlook the fact that even though India historically has only contributed 3.3% to global emissions since the Industrial Revolution, I think over a 200-year span, where the US contributed 25.4%, India has contributed 3.3%. Europe has contributed 31%. So, and China today, because of its growth in the last 40 years, has already, in that 200-year period, China shares already up to the high teens because of the fact that it's growing so much and consuming so much now. So India is still a very, very small villain in the global climate debate. And even today, the average Indian household consumes about 10% of the average American household in terms of energy consumption. Now, I say all that to say that you've got to see the problem in context. Per capita, India is one of the lowest energy consumers and polluters in the world. But of course, because we're talking 1.4 billion people, it does now involve a rather significant amount. So we still rely heavily on coal and fossil fuels. 75% of our current power consumption comes out of thermal plants. We can't help it. And it's going to grow. The irony is it's growing rather at a galloping pace. And we've gone up to, I think, 893 metric tons of coal that we consumed for electricity purposes in the last fiscal year. And it's predicted to go up to about 1,800 by 2047. And then it will come down as the renewables start kicking in. Installed capacity of renewables has gone up to about 45%. But again, it's one thing to install a capacity, another to generate it. Yes. How do we intend to achieve energy interdependence? Well, we're pursuing all sorts of things simultaneously, and each has its challenges and drawbacks. There's solar. India has founded at Paris the International Solar Alliance, and is a leading mover and shaker in that. But the problem is that we're still dependent heavily on a hostile nation, China, for solar panels. Solar is still not economically viable.
You're not the only one.
Yeah, well, but for us, it costs more than our coal does. So we are investing in solar. We won't even reach break even until 2030. And all the targets announced for solar energy, I take with a generous bushel of salt. They're not going to be met in the realistic future. We are also trying everything else. We've got hydroelectricity. We're trying to explore tidal waves offshore to generate power. There's wind energy. But all of these things are climate dependent and variable and not as secure, affordable, inexpensive, and efficient as coal is. There are two things that I would still see as positive. One is biomass. We generate an awful lot of animal waste, of wood chip waste, of agricultural waste. We're not effectively exploiting. We're beginning to do it. I think we've got something like 60 biomass plants already. We could go up to 6,000 of those and generate a lot more energy through biomass. And the other is not fashionable to say, but I genuinely think we should not be dissing nuclear. You know, David, that the US and India have an Indo-US nuclear agreement, but not one nuclear plant has come out of it yet, ostensibly because the US is still worried about liability issues. After Chernobyl and Bhopal and 3 Mile Island and Fukushima now, you just can't be sure that nuclear plants, but if you can just improve your security protocols, nuclear is still clean, it's efficient. India gets only 3% of its energy from nuclear. I think that could easily go up to 10, if not more, in the years ahead. But with all of this, we can certainly be more dependent on ourselves. Independence, I think, is still a chimera.
Let's look at infrastructure in general. India is projected by some to have the world's largest economy by 2050.
Yeah.
Such an economy will require an extraordinary information, technical, and energy infrastructure to support it. What steps are being taken to look to that not far off 25-year prospect?
Look, I mean, infrastructure is a challenge. There's both physical infrastructure and tech infrastructure. We're doing better on the latter than on the former. Even though the most visible progress has been made in the former, it's been done in unseemly haste, as we have discovered this year, when a series of major projects inaugurated by the Prime Minister himself, timed, of course, for before the election so he could get the credit for it before people voted, have all begun to collapse. We've had 3 airport canopies in new airports commissioned this year collapsing, one of which killed a person. We've had 2 highways, major highways, developing embarrassingly visible cracks. In one place, an entire chunk of highway fell on the ground below. Fortunately, no one was walking by. We've had, amongst various other embarrassments, a grandiose and widely touted statue of Maharaja Chhatrapati Shivaji, the great Maratha warrior hero who the Hindutva forces particularly like to tout because he fought against a Muslim king, Aurangzeb. They overlooked the fact that he had Muslim generals on his side and the Mughal emperor had Hindu generals on his side, but be that as it may, he is touted as a hero. They built this great statue to him, commissioned it, and the statue crumbled before the horrified eyes of the populace within a few months of being commissioned. So there's just too much of this sort of hasty desire to sort of commission and declare projects completed before they've been done. There's obviously inadequate attention to the quality of materials and equipment. Apparently the statue collapsed because of rusty bolts and nuts that were used in holding up the various pieces of the statue. An embarrassment. So that kind of physical infrastructure work really needs significant improvement. We're talking about investing $1 trillion by 2040 in infrastructure. And if we want to raise that money, we better do a better job of it. Tech infrastructure, on the other hand, is doing very well. The so-called India Tech Stack, which has involved opening bank accounts for literally everybody, including in the poorest villages, seeding some of those bank accounts with small donations from the government, having even banking correspondents take little portable ATMs to the homes of poor villagers so that if you won't go to the banks will come to you, kind of thing. A thing called the UPI, the United Payments Interface, which is rivaling and probably is considered simpler to use than the American SWIFT system that has now already been adopted by 11 developing countries, invented entirely in India with Indian technology. The Aadhaar, which is a kind of electronic identity card with biometric data embedded in it, that given that's 1.4 billion people who have Aadhaars, yes, there's some glitches, and some people have, given fake identities, and some people have enrolled their pets for a lark and revealed it to the media. My dog has an Aadhaar card, So there's some of these things also go wrong, and there was one very major scandal when a whole bunch of Aadhaar cards were dumped on the deep web, the black market, the dark web. I beg your pardon. So there are problems like that, but it still has been an incredibly ambitious undertaking, which has no parallel in the world, not even in China, and which potentially could be used for all sorts of good things, including the transfer of government benefits directly to the beneficiary, cutting out the intermediaries, and thereby preventing money being siphoned off. That should
electronic wallets, yes.
All of that.
Two final questions. Financial system. Is India's financial system, banking system, up to task in terms of everything we have been discussing?
Yes, I mean, look, in the opposition we raise questions all the time, so there's some aspects we do question, including there's a scandal right now involving the SEBI, the principal regulator. But the banking system on the whole has a lot to say for itself, including the fact that our relatively conservative but well-managed Reserve Bank of India has outpaced and outperformed most central banks around the world in the last 20 years, including keeping us from enduring the worst of the 2008-2009 global meltdown, the financial crisis that all of you were not exempt from. We, by and large, survived that. Yes, we were helped by remittances from our workers in the Gulf and so on, but beyond that, it was just adroit financial management. And that is, by and large, well spoken of. I think our central banker just recently was ranked first amongst the world's leading central bankers. And he's not even an economist by training, but he seems to know what he's doing. So there's some good things that are going on, but there are some problems. There have been some scandals, including the current SEBI chief. There's also been some issues to do with the writing off of rather large sums of money as non-performing assets by the banking system, which in some cases the opposition alleges, with good reason, may have been done to favor certain friends of the ruling establishment, and that's not entirely kosher. So there are some aspects that we continue to question, but on the whole, as I say, international judgment of India's banking system is very positive, and our stock markets too. We have the oldest stock market in Asia, going back to 1820 when the Bombay Stock Exchange was established, and it's doing well. India has the software, as it were, literally the ways of running a modern 21st century economy that many other countries, the Chinese really have never fully understood and built up, for example, by comparison. So that's one good strength in the Indian economic system. Yeah.
Last question. Is there the potential, should there be, a formal defense relationship between India and the United States?
It's difficult for India to swallow that because, we had 200 years of other countries deciding for us what stand we should take on world affairs. Our soldiers were sent around the world to fight other people's wars, the British in particular. And so the principal preoccupation of the independence movement was to resume control of our own decision-making about our place in the world. And sovereign autonomy became the buzzword. There's a wonderful apocryphal, I'm sure it's apocryphal, story of John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower's rather Manichaean Secretary of State, asking Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister, "Are you with us or against us?" And the story goes, Nehru says, "Yes." So we're with you when we agree with you, we're against you when we disagree, and we preserve the right to do that. That was always very important to India. So we've been allergic to alliances, and we've never used the word alliance for any of our agreements, even Quad is called a strategic partnership or words to that effect, not an alliance. And the same in all, even the days when we were very lovey-dovey with the Soviets and signed a treaty with them the time of the 1971 war with Pakistan. We called it a treaty of friendship and not an alliance. So it's something that I think it's very difficult to imagine. But at the nuts and bolts level, David, there are agreements that people don't talk about very much, but they're happening. There's an agreement, for example, on the mutual sharing of logistics facilities, which means American ships and personnel can stop at Indian bases. I don't think you're going to see too many Indian soldiers showing up at your bases in this country, or even at Subic Bay, but you can see Americans now coming. And that's very important because you've got potentially, in the event that the incipient Cold War 2.0, as somebody has called it, turns into a hot war, the sea lanes that go past India are vital for any American capacity to interdict the Chinese heading towards the South China Sea. And India is crucial. And you know, we've got the entire Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea stretch. Then you've got the Andaman Seas going past Indian territory, and you've got the Straits of Malacca, and then going on into the South China Sea. And India could be a very, very vital partner, de facto ally in that kind of situation where we haven't got there yet. But the way the world is going, anything could happen. The Chinese could be provoked to doing something foolish on Taiwan. America might react. You might suddenly have a hot war. And then where does India stand? The irony is we are not so sure where the US would stand if we had a hot land war with the Chinese. Because I wouldn't bet on the Americans coming to our assistance there, except maybe through satellite intelligence or something like that. But if a sea war were to develop, I can see the US asking India for help. And some of these are areas that go into realms that I no longer have any access to. I don't see classified material. But I'm assuming the US and India are talking about all these, or the half a dozen little defense agreements of detail that do exist. It's not a defense treaty, it's not a formal alliance. So the fact that they talk about logistic sharing, access to bases, sharing of technology, interoperability, joint exercises, all these things are happening quietly. There's not a great deal of publicity, but they are happening. And that suggests a closeness that can't easily be rolled back.
Very good. Shashi, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For coming back to the Institute.
Thank
Thank you. This was good.
Thank you all.
Again, thank you all for attending. We look forward to seeing all of you, old faces and new, at the further events we will be holding here. We appreciate very much your support. Thank you.
Thank you.